All right. Thank you, Mr. Rowdy. All right, welcome everyone to the July version of the Water Committee meeting. Thank you everyone for taking the time to be here. As we begin, open it up for public comment. Anyone who would like to come and speak to the committee, please step forward. Alex, you want to start off, ladies first?
Thank you, and good morning, and thank you for your hard work on a very difficult task. I want to talk briefly about the goals of the committee, obviously the problems we're facing, and it's getting scary out there, quite frightening when you see dry riverbeds that are dependent on spring flows, the Guadalupe at zero, the Frio at 0 cubic feet per second. It hasn't been that way since the 1950s. I found out this morning that in Concan they actually had water rationing. About a week or two ago, there was a notice for water rationing in that community. I didn't see any press on that. And there actually are a lot of smoldering problems that are not receiving press coverage. One of them locally, I've been checking over the last few weeks, and just to show you how serious this is, and then I'm going to go on to the planning committee and what the goals are and how this relates. I've been contacting local drilling companies. And according to one woman, she's worked with a company for decades. She said, I've never seen it this bad. We're getting 30 to 50 calls per day. There are wait lists for service, and whether your well has failed or not, they're going to charge you. Some people can lower the pumps, some cannot. Water trucks have wait lists now from a week to a month, and that depends on who you call. Bandera, as we know, is nearing the disaster point where they have a stage 5, I understand. And the biggest point that is most frightening, we don't know when this will end, how long it will continue, and even if we do get respite rains with current forecasts by the National Weather Service, this is going to be an ongoing trend. More drought, more severe, hotter temperatures, more evaporation, and at the same point when we're expecting massive growth in the area. The Trinity Aquifer is completely unlike the Edwards. There's a very nice video by Cow Creek. I attempted to download it last night. For some reason, I had technical issues. 10 minutes, incredibly informative, best 10 minutes of education you can find. And basically, it explains how complex and unpredictable this is. A lot of rock layers, very unpredictable geology. It's been studied by many for decades, and we still don't understand it completely. It's complex, misunderstood, and actually can be quite confusing at times. Some key points are the recharge coefficient. Most of Kendall County, by the way, is a recharge zone for the Trinity Aquifer. Only 4 to 6% of the water that falls by rainfall actually reaches groundwater, generally. But there are pockets, areas such as southeast Kendall County, where they have more caves, more sinkholes, and there probably is where we have our greatest recharge resources. I live further to the north. I'm within a mile of a cave, and I have a large sinkhole on my property. But these sinkholes and caves are spread throughout, but we know for sure that near Cascade Caverns, where all the growth is occurring, there are a lot of caves in that region. The water moves within this aquifer. It's very unpredictable when we have these dry spells. 2 wells very close to each other. One can go dry, the other one might be okay. The key point that I'm worried about as far as this committee is concerned, you are doing the right thing by diversifying our regional water supply. We certainly don't want to be dependent on just one source. The problem is, what is that water going to be used for? Is it emergency backup for pretty much our existing community, or is it planned for massive growth, particularly along the I-35 corridor, which is not in Kendall County, but also within Kendall County? One area of concern that I've mentioned is the Southeast Quadrant, where I went there yesterday just to see a proposed site for a new apartment complex. This complex is basically going to be a sea of concrete, a large parking lot. I imagine the amount of impervious cover is going to be over 80%. There's a community next to it, South Glen. To me, my impression was it was nothing but roads, driveways, houses. I saw very little impervious cover left in that community. If this trend continues, we are going to be disrupting one of the most valuable recharge areas that we have. And that's going to be a significant detriment. If we don't recharge the Trinity Aquifer, it will eventually deplete to the point where people will have massive cost of redrilling wells if they hit usable water and some will lose their water source altogether. What the city does affects Kendall County overall, and I ask with all due respect that we consider that as we go with future planning. I would even think in the back of my mind, perhaps the Trinity recharge zone needs to be addressed in a manner similar to the Edwards recharge zone was addressed for special protection. I don't think this has been given adequate attention, and if I could, I would like to see that happen, where we examine the potential to preserve areas within Kendall County. We have every reason to be able to protect ourselves from the harm that will occur when this aquifer is depleted. And I believe that could be a useful tool going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Mr. Kyle?
Good morning, committee members. My name is Lance Kyle. My address is 226 Cascade Caverns Road. I sent you all an email earlier with my comments. Also a letter to a local private water provider in Kendall County. The city of Bernie must conserve its backup water supply, which it has sourced from the GBRA for the past 15 to 20 years. The city can't keep squandering this resource on high-density development in its ETJ. In the past 10 years, more than 65% of the growth in Kendall County has been in the city of Bernie. This is partially due to the provision of water by the city to out-of-state developers. And almost all of the 5 home per acre subdivisions are also in the city. Providing water to George's Ranch just compromises the backup water supply further. It is not fair to the citizens. San Jose Water Company, or SJWTX, and its Kendall West Utility, KWU, subsidiary are not the problem. The city, they've got about 1,200 connections, I believe, in Kendall County and about 400 in Bandera. City of Bernie has 8,000, and in the next 2-3 years, according to my math, should have 10,000. We've got 10 apartment complexes on the books in progress. Anyway, the city of Bernie is the problem. Sorry to be so strong, but you know I'm not a diplomat. We can control private water companies like San Jose Water through a mix of legislation, litigation, and zoning. Whenever the city wants something, it threatens litigation or it litigates. Well, it needs to want this badly, or we need to change an administration. Same with Sauls. They were pushed out of Lily Ranch. They also need to be pushed out of Corley Farms. The citizens of Kendall County don't want more pipelines. This state's already crisscrossed with just too many pipelines. The recent county survey demonstrates that, the one commissioned by Commissioner Elkins, I believe it was early last year or the year before. More than 90% of respondents want this mismanaged land use controlled. Imported water creates more problems than it solves. It's just too artificial and unsustainable. Thank you.
All right, anyone else in the gallery have comments they'd like to share? I don't see anyone. How about anyone on the Zoom call? I'm not sure I could access it anyway since our help is gone, but I don't see anyone taking their microphone off mute. So we'll progress on to introductory remarks. Are there any remarks from the committee that folks would like to share before we move into the heart of our program today?
You have anything?
Yeah, I just want to say, so I personally neglected to put this meeting's information up on the website. And so there were some citizens who nagged me and said, when is that meeting? When is that meeting? And I got some information out, and I think they circulated it, but I failed on that. And I feel bad about that because I believe in transparency, and I want to make sure the public knows when and where to meet to hear what we're talking about. And it makes me think that really, honestly, the Kendall County Water website, Water Committee website is not necessarily the best place to promote and encourage the public to attend or at least take note. And I wonder if we might be able to place that on the Bernie website for notification.
You can certainly ask.
Okay.
Ben, do you know, is there a link on the city website to?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Not that
At
I'm
a
aware-
minimum, we need to accomplish that. I mean, it'd be better to have the whole thing.
I think it'd be better to put it in there with Transportation Planning Committee, P&Z, all that jazz.
Oh, I agree.
So-
I agree.
So it can be as transparent as possible.
All right.
I do want to add a comment, or maybe a bit of an admonishment to all of us. We've been meeting and we've moved the needle to some degree here, but we still have some heavy lifting work to do, and we need to get to the business of doing the work and getting our recommendations ready to go to council in whole. And so I think the sooner that we commit ourselves to moving that forward, I agree. And as difficult as it is, and to the public comment, as difficult as it is during a time of drought, it's probably the most opportune time to be talking about water and the reality of water and the reality of supply and firm supply and that we're going to have going into the future for the people who are here now and for whatever growth is determined to happen, whether it's managed growth or whether it's uncontrolled growth. I got strong opinions about that, but it's our job to make sure the water resources are identified, at least, and if we don't have them identified, what are the mechanisms and studies that need to be done to accomplish that from a technical standpoint? And the city does need some of that from a technical standpoint. So I admonish myself as well as all the rest of us and those online listening, we need to get to the business of doing the work. We have talked a lot about conservation, and it's some very good conservation discussion, some very good information, and we're getting to enjoy that effort now. The play on words being enjoy, utilize that during this drought and what's going to be a very long, hot and dry summer. But as I said when we first began this, to look at conservation as future supply is fool's gold, because it's times right now where the water's not available, and if we lean on that as part of what we do to justify the population count that we're going to have here, we're making a grievous error. If it's conservation, it's conservation. It's held in conservation. So that's my 2 cents.
All right.
Sorry for the rant. No, I'm not sorry for the rant. Actually, I dialed it back, to be honest with you. So.
Well, I just want to follow up on that because I was reflecting as you were talking. I was thinking, well, you're right. I mean, I hear exactly what you mean. And I also sit there and go, well, we talk about backup water supplies and augmenting water supplies, but if conservation isn't a piece of that consideration, or if backup water supplies become primary water supplies, it starts to fail in that regard as well. Then are we really solving the problem, or are we kicking the ball down the road? And maybe, I don't know. Toward what end, I guess?
Well, yeah, if we look at it's how are we going to view that water, and it's a longer discussion than maybe we have today, but it's one that's ripe to have. If we're just doing it on a balance sheet and per capita use, and we've reduced per capita use, and Donovan, y'all have gone through these exercises, you should be very proud of the work y'all have done at SAWS in terms of dialing use back. But then when you look on the balance sheet, you have capacity, and I don't want that. It's conservation because it is the right thing to do. It's the proper practice to do. It helps run the utility or the water supplies more efficiently. But if we just simply then divert that water over for more capita, then I think we lose it. It's conservation for conservation, and that's the way to look at it in my book. So.
I think there are great arguments to be made on any side of this issue. The beautiful thing is we're not policymakers. We don't have to worry about how they decide it. We are information gatherers and presenters of information. And so the beautiful thing is, to your point, to both of your points, is that we never has it been more important for us to do our jobs and to answer the call that we've been asked to respond to. And so I think we've done good work so far on the conservation effort. This is the next step we've been tasked with, and it is important to press forward and to provide concrete responses and propose solutions, and then those who make those decisions will decide what to do with that information.
Well, I think we heard in public comment we want less concrete responses.
All right. Any other comments before?
Patrick, if I could just pile on a little bit. I was just thinking back, when the mayor convened this, it was primarily his concern that the population estimates were off.
Right.
Within the given plan that we're working with. But in that plan, there are several alternative source discussions, but also some alternative technologies. And as it's already been mentioned, we really haven't looked at any of those options, current updates relative to those. It was mentioned the Trinity Aquifer is a large unknown. There were several recommendations they called out. Bathymetric studies of the lake, test wells. And my concern is all of those come with the budget, and those are pretty long-range capital plans and very expensive data points to gather. And so I kind of echo, Tommy's remarks that there are some things that I think we need to really look at that original plan, decide if some of those original recommendations are valid, and then work with the city, our original focus, to see whether we should recommend implementation of those or look for other alternative technologies to address some of those issues.
Well, and I think it's incumbent upon us as this next phase develops is to provide a somewhat comprehensive evaluation of what the supply side of this looks like. And that goes to technology, it goes to a variety of different iterations, right? Whether it's raw supply, reclamation, there are a lot of different eggs in this basket. What we're told to do with that basket once we go to them and say, here are your potential tools and your options, we may get told, drill down on this, forget about that and other things. But I think we're still in that investigative stage. Mm-hmm. It's important for us to turn over every possible rock. Mm-hmm. Some of those may be absolutely ludicrous to go down, but that's not our decision to make, unless it's just, catastrophically stupid, and we'll try to avoid that. I don't want to waste anyone's time unnecessarily, but that being said, I don't want to say any idea is a bad idea at this point in time. Let's let those who make those decisions say, pass on that, let's look at this. So we've talked about some things, and some of those have been very meaningful and solid. I'd like to harness some of the collective intelligence here today and get a bit more of a comprehensive list. I think we walked out of here last meeting with 3, 4, maybe 5 different items that what were potential supply side issues we'd like to take to council and at least let them evaluate and consider and then tell us what they want to do with them. I think that the list should probably be longer than that. And so I'd like to tap your intellect and coming up with a better list so we can do more research, provide more information on that, and then put forth a report that you're talking about, Tommy, give the council something to work with, and then that will in turn help us get the information we need for them to come back with ultimately a plan that they want us to help fashion.
So I think an important consideration is what are we trying to solve for? I mean, and to put it in context, we're in a city right now that cannot annex, right? So it can't grow in that sense unless somebody says, hey, we want to be annexed by you. And there's discussion about, water could be a hook for annexation or it could be a way to get development agreements. But of course, that also depends on people negotiating the development agreements, being in good faith with the citizens, and not essentially funding growth with water. Does that translate to annexation? I don't know. Does it translate to true development agreements at the level, say, of our Unified Development Code? I don't know. Is there a way to solve for that? If that's one of the hooks, if that's one of their justifications. But the other reason I say it is because Mike Mann gave a presentation to us last time, and he was saying, look, Bernie has enough water to actually handle a lot. The county, of course, we're hearing stress. We're hearing stress in the groundwater supply. But it has enough water. It has enough water in reserve at GBRA. So it begs the question, what are we solving for? And I think that's important.
Well, I think it is important for what we're solving for, but we don't really answer that question. What we're told to do is find out ways to enhance what we have and to open up the door for what? Hold on, let me finish. Sorry. And to plan for the future, whatever that future is. Now, there are numbers of a variety of different sorts as to what growth is. What we think growth is, what growth might be if different policy decisions are made, whether that enhances or increases growth or whether it curtails growth. But those are questions that are really not for us to answer unless we're told to factor them in. What we're told to do is go out and figure out if we need more water, how do we do that? And put our thinking caps on, what does that mean to have more water? Well, conservation is an aspect of that, having more of what you already have.
So in fact,
hold on a second. Sorry. Using more of what you have, yep. Okay. Taking and treating what we have in a different way, reclamation, finding alternate third-party sources, right, or enhanced efficiencies with what we already have, right? So those are the ones I'm aware of. Now, there may be many more, and that's what I'd like to delve down into. But what I want to do is steer clear of saying this policy, that policy, the other policy, because I haven't been told what the policy is. I'm just been told to go out and get the information. We put together the information, just like we did with the conservation programs. They make the decisions.
Right.
I hear you. Okay. And the reason I also bring that up is because in some contexts, if we're talking about funding, pipelines, and things like that, the question becomes, why are you asking the taxpayers to do that, right? And so I guess you're saying that's not our concern,
It's not.
but I do think it's worth putting on the table as a legitimate question.
And I think you're right. Not to diminish what you're saying. Those are realistic. I think part of if our task was simply to say, hey, there's water over here and there's water over there, I think that's an inefficient use of your intelligence and your time. I think we have to say the pros and cons, and then council has some educated analysis of what we're presenting, whether it be a financial side or other policy considerations. So I think part of it has to be, the analysis has to be not just there's this path, but here are pros and cons that we've seen. I mean, otherwise, you might as well Google it, and that'll get you there.
I agree with that.
So, all right. Any other comments before we step into the meat of Mr. Donovan's presentation today? All right. Seeing none, if you would, sir, tell us about SAWS.
All right. Well, and I address I go into some of these same topics, so I'll risk of repeating. So let me just sort of preface the presentation. So I've got a whole bunch of slides, and how I've kind of divided it is what we're doing for planning efforts at SAWS, kind of a specific, we're going through a very specific, what we call water management plan right now, which is apropos to kind of what's happening here. And then later in the presentation, go into sort of more specific to Bernie and Kendall County and the area. So that's how I've kind of got it divided. Let me start with the legal disclaimer. I'm not here to sell water. Those are all discussions left to our board members. If ultimately there's a request for wholesale water, that goes through our board. Our board makes those policy decisions. So what I'm talking about is how we plan, how we ensure that SAWS has enough water, and sort of a planning environment, and then ultimately kind of the terms of what our wholesale contracts are right now with the utilities that we have. So that's kind of what I've got here. Let me just kind of go through some of the slides. I don't need to go through all of who we are, but we talk about city limits and annexation and all that. We've got over 2 million population that we're serving. We don't just serve the city of San Antonio. We go outside the city limits. And so that's another part of this discussion that obviously is way beyond the scope of this committee, but those policymakers have to make those kinds of decisions. I think it goes to the point you make, which is give the information to the policymakers and let them make the decisions. So I think we go into that. We do that. We have a lot of accountability, a lot of responsibility to take care of our system. About 1,700 employees doing that. Some of these accomplishments, this is the brag slide. We like to brag about a lot of the good things, but I do this not just to brag, but just to say that this is what comes out of the policy making, and the appropriate policy making coupled with sort of input from the public and the right input from the policymakers come up with these accomplishments. We've got now the nation's largest recycle system, the Purple Pipe system. We've got the largest groundwater-based aquifer storage and recovery system in the country. We've got almost 200,000 acre feet in storage right now. We've got a brackish desalination plant right there in Bexar County. We feel like we're the nation's leader in water conservation. Water conservation is absolutely a piece of all puzzles and a big piece of it, so we're big fans. And now we've got the largest water public-private partnership in the nation. So a lot of this comes from planning. How we do the planning, obviously we do day-to-day planning. We've got people focused on what our needs are from a daily basis, but we go through an exercise every 5 years to where we check in and make sure that we're planning for the right, I'll call it the North Star. Are we planning for the right conditions or the right droughts? Are we taking into account what our current supplies actually do? And sort of check in every 5 years from a water management plan. Our water management plan, we look at obviously the population and the demands of those population sources. Population demands really is almost two separate things. I should probably separate them out because the population, what population you're planning for is a big topic. One a lot of projections in there, and you don't know ultimately. You have to make a call, and oftentimes you're wrong. We plan for diversifying our water sources. We plan for conservation. We look at regional partnerships. What kinds of regional partnerships do we want to do? Technology, something we started talking about as well, I think is a big piece of your water management plan altogether. So I think needs to be part of the overall solution. And then just supply management. Do we have the right supply in the right place at the right time? So it's not enough just to say, do we have enough inventory on the shelf? Is it in the right place? We also have to plan for extreme weather, both on the flooding side and the drought side. Obviously, from a water management plan, our main focus is on the drought side. What will extreme droughts look like to our water supplies? Will the Edwards, what level will the Edwards be? What level will the lakes be? Those sorts of things. What will that do to our water supplies? But also, what will it do to demand? Will it increase our customers' demand to pour water on their grass? That sort of thing. So we have to look at both of those sides and work on both the conservation and demand side, but also ensure that we have enough supplies in the right way. The output, what that kind of looks like, we've got charts and we run essentially a drought of record, but we at the 2017 water management plan, we created what we call the hybrid drought of record. The drought of record is the 1950s, a duration of about 9 years. And then we also added on the intensity of the drought of the 2011 to 2014 timeframe. So that was to kind of try to capture some of these extreme weather events that we're experiencing now, including obviously this year. So, you get into lots of climate change models and some of that, and we're approaching that in this new water management plan. But we have to put those in there. We look at every particular supply. I just mentioned a second ago, there are some supplies that while it's full, the Edwards, we've got 260-something thousand acre feet of Edwards. But in the worst year of the drought of record, we don't have 260,000 acre feet. That's reduced by over 40%. The Trinity Aquifer, we've got, in theory, over 20,000 acre feet of Trinity Aquifer water supplies contracted for. In a drought of record, we plan for about 2,000 to 3,000 acre feet. It's just not there. So all of those go into these kinds of bar charts. You see the lines across the middle. We plan for essentially different demand sides. What are our customers going to do? Is it a normal demand year? Is it a high demand year? How are we doing it in terms of working with our customers? Are they reducing their supplies? And then it's kind of a little confusing, but the yellow hash marks above is our aquifer storage and recovery. We don't bring all of that back in 1 year. We have to plan it in a way that we stretch it out over a 7-year period. So we only plan for bringing back the aquifer storage and recovery, the yellow hash marks, in a certain amount of increments all throughout the period. And then you're also infrastructure limited on that. And so we have to plan for really very specific supplies, all the externalities, the external conditions, as well as the demand side. And that's what some of these charts look like when we output. So in the 2017 plan, we've got water taking us out in the worst hybrid drought of record out to 2070 with our planned supplies and demand management tools. Like I said, we are going through that again this year, and so we're going to take another fresh look at that. And do we have enough? Do we want to bring on new supplies and that sort of thing? We talk about conservation as one of the first new sources. It's absolutely the first place we look at. I think we owe it to our customers to make sure that we're doing as much as we can with what we're asking out of them. They're paying a lot of money for a lot of different supplies, particularly what we've got. And so, we've done a heck of a job over the past 40 years, all of 50% decrease in our GPCD, gallons per capita per day. And then we've got another 30% reduction planned out through 2070. So all of that factors into, again, all this goes back into those supplies and that demand management, that GPCD. So a very important part. Diversified supplies are very critical. You go back to the 1990s, where we were essentially a one-horse town. We had just Edwards Aquifer, about 100%. Now you look to today, and we're just a little over 50% Edwards supply, and that will continue out through 2070. We are a very diverse supply organization now. We've got now 15 different water projects from 9 different sources. It's a great thing. It's a great tool. There are hiccups with it. There are issues with it that you have to deal with. But obviously, you have to go out far away. You look again at the Vista Ridge project is 140 miles away. So we have to look beyond just our boundaries. Unfortunately, we can't just leave it to right in our county. We can't just take it all from the Edwards Aquifer. Those have issues as well. And so to lock up some of these supplies that we need, again, we're doing as much as we can on the demand side, but you have to go outside the county and sometimes as far as 140 miles away. Also, just one more thing on the 140 miles away, you also have to, and as what's plugged into there is the regulatory structure, so that we have to go 140 miles away also because of some of the regulations that are in place in Texas law, particularly with groundwater. We have some issues with groundwater, and we think some of that drives people, to different areas of the state, and so. The difficulty, what I said, the 15 supplies, the difficulty of having a diverse supply is it becomes very complex. We've got one of the most complex utilities in, I think, the nation, really. Again, the 15 supplies, you got a whole bunch of wells and tanks and things that you have to manage to make sure that if one area goes down, you have it backed up by something else. So we've got a whole lot of moving parts within the system. And that's exacerbated with a diversified supply, that you have to make sure that you've got redundancy on top of redundancy on top of redundancy to make sure. Again, it's all computerized. Another issue with it, with all of that stuff and all those people, you've got to computerize everything. But you also have an incredible human element that needs to go into it. Computers can't solve everything, although they're an enormous part of our supply. But it's difficult. The other thing I would say is, our system is set up, and this goes into, as we get into more specific in terms of Bernie, our system is not a centralized supply where you just throw it in one pipeline and run it around the entire system. We've got a whole bunch of pressure zones. We've got about 1,400 feet of elevation difference between the northwest area up in this area to the far southeast area of our system. And so we have to manage all of those supplies also based off of pressure zone. And so it's, again, not as simple as saying, here's all of our supplies on the shelf, we've got enough, and let's just put it in this particular area. We've got to build infrastructure to meet these particular areas and these particular pressure zones. And so that's what gets into really the Bernie piece of it. Again, for our long term, what we're looking for, again, from the 2017 Water Management Plan, there are really 3 pieces to that. The near term was to finish the Vista Ridge project and get that online. That did happen. It's running great. It's producing full amount. We're integrating it into our system. Our next new addition to our supplies is from the local Carrizo, basically the native Carrizo aquifer in southern Bexar County. We're going to increase what we already have, and then bring on additional phases of our brackish desalination plant. The brackish we learn as we go along, again, as part of this 5-year check-in. We will have to go even further out. The brackish project, we're going to have to build wells further into Wilson County and that sort of area. So you learn a lot as you go along. So what that does is, as part of this thriving economy, we've got a commitment to conservation. We've got successful diversification. Technologies, again, I didn't really talk about all the technologies involved, but technology is a huge part of the demand. Well, in the conservation side, making sure that you have the technologies in the place in people's hands, make that conversation go well between you, the utility, and the customer. It gives them the power and the tools to reduce their own water supply. That helps us. Part of this new technology is an AMI, automated metering, and so we're embarking on that. We're spending over $100 million putting that in place. And that really gives us water supply for decades. So let me go into a little bit in terms of wholesale. Who do we wholesale to currently? we've got about 4 different entities that we have wholesale agreements with. We've got the city of Elmendorf, just a little under 100 acre feet. East Central Utility, which is out in the east side of Bexar County, growing like crazy. They've got about 800 acre feet of wholesale water. The Kendall County WCID, and this is the one that we've had a lot of discussion over as well. That's obviously in the Kendall County side. And then the Oaks, just a very small water supply organization, 60 acre feet. Major terms, just sort of the major terms of our wholesale agreements that we have. Obviously, go back to the SAWS board approval, repeat that. Every one of these wholesale agreements have to go through our SAWS board. Those conversations will be led by and decided on by our city board, our water board. Ultimately, the rates are subject to the city council. All of SAWS, SAWS is a separate entity, but we're owned by the city of San Antonio, so the city council sets our rates. So any adjustments to our water wholesale rates will go through the city council. They will set the rates. I'll go into a little bit more of that. We have wholesale rates generally. Right now, we also have separate as a Vista Ridge wholesale. And what we said was, if you're going to wholesale water from the Vista Ridge pipeline directly, that will need a separate rate going through city council. It may be similar, it may be different, but that's up to the city council. So if we're looking at a specific straight off of the Vista Ridge pipeline, that would need to go through the city council to set a new rate. We require that the utilities we have in place develop the water conservation plan, and that's submitted to the TCEQ. We look at that. Obviously, it's something our board will take into account. Does our board feel like the entity we're wanting to wholesale to is doing enough to promote conservation? If they feel like that there's no conservation really in place, they might have a different take. In terms of the major deal, we have what's called a take-or-pay annual commitment. So the entity would sign up for whatever an annual commitment is. Let's just pretend it's 1,000 acre feet. You'll sign up for 1,000 acre feet, and that will be essentially what you pay, what you will pay for every year, assuming we can provide it. We have to provide that as the ability to provide it. There is also a monthly meter charge that goes along with that, and then the impact fees associated with that. The volumetric rate is all sort of wrapped up in there, and some pass-through fees for the EAA. We pay for the EAA fees and the TCEQ fees. Ultimately, that comes to around $2,100 an acre foot at this point. It depends on your volumetric. The other piece to that I would throw out is, let me go back to the take-or-pay, the 1,000 acre feet. If you sign up for 1,000 acre feet and you only take 800 acre feet, you pay for 1,000. If you sign up for 1,000 and you take 1,500, you pay the 1,000 at the regular rate, and then the 500 additional is essentially double. It's basically double the cost. So it's a big. It's not a penalty. But it's to encourage planning. And we went through a period in really the early 2000s where we had the Bear Met entity out there. And they didn't want to build enough water supplies. They didn't want to bring on enough water supplies, so they wanted to use us for a planning tool. And so we set that up as a make sure that we're planning in the correct way. The other thing I would say in terms of right now, what we have are that these take-or-pay commitments are subject to EAA cutbacks. This is kind of a relic of, back to the major supply. It is the cornerstone of our water supply. So if, let me go back to that hypothetical again, you sign up for 1,000 acre feet. If the Edwards Aquifer in a year like this year is cut back 20 or 30%, your amount is cut back 20 or 30% as well, which means that, let's just take 20%. I'm terrible at math. Some people can help me with math. Let's say it becomes, if it's 20%, now it's 800 acre feet. So your requirement essentially is now only 800 acre feet. But what it does is it also means that the over base amount, that let's say you take a full 1,000, now that 200 is at the higher rate, the double rate. So it requires a little bit of more planning, and a lot of times it requires to kind of sign up for a little bit more than you, quote, need, because you need to plan for these cutbacks just like we do as well. When you look specifically at Bernie, again, Mike Mann and the city of Bernie can talk more about that. The only information we have is obviously Region L and what we hear. I didn't incorporate stuff from Mike's discussion last week or last month, whenever that was. You look to Region L, these are the population amounts, and we know already that those are not correct. What are we at? About 20,000 in terms of population just in the 2020 decade. And so these numbers are understated. And, that goes back to the discussion about do we want to use water, as some people would want to use water as a discouragement tool to bring more people in, or is it promoting growth? And a lot of times, when people want to move here, they don't move here for the water. They move here for a whole lot of issues. And so when you take away the water equation, it doesn't mean that people aren't going to move here. People will still move here, and then they will have this expectation that the city leaders provide that water in place. So population, how do we plan for going future population? Current water supplies, again, all this information comes straight out of Region L. It looks like the water supplies are roughly staying the same throughout, and so is that enough to take care of all future demands? The gallons per capita per day, it looks like that is going largely in the right direction. You've got in the 170s to 160s, back in the 2011 time frame. We're about 151 in 2020. I don't know what they were, probably 2021 was a little less. There was some rain in the summertime, but that's the GPCD data in terms of demand. And then again, straight out of the Region L plan, the 2020 decade, if you assume that same population and these same GPCD data, they have, looks like a surplus of about 2,600 acre feet with the first supply needs in 2050. Again, using all of that data. But, when you put in more supply, you put in whatever the per capita will be over the next few years, I would say those parentheses numbers probably scoot left a little bit. But those are just the decisions to be made by the city of Bernie. So in terms of potential wholesale to the city of Bernie, obviously the two major questions are volume and timing. How much will the city need? That goes back again to is it 1,700 in 2030? Is it some other number? It goes back to that volume, and when do we need it? Do we need it now? Do we need it 10 years from now? The other thing I would point out, and obviously Darrell will know this very well, these projects don't happen overnight. Some of these projects, I can go into a whole lot of other projects that we've been planning for decades, and they never happen. So you have to, you plan for these things, and they never happen. Or when they do happen, it's a good 10 years in the making. Even the Vista Ridge project, it was done in a approach that we started really in 2009, 2010 time frame, and didn't come online until 2020. That was really super fast. So a decade is a very fast project to start from scratch. When we look at our infrastructure, again, this is just all of the different water utilities out there. You've got the city of Bernie. You can see ours in the blue there. It goes slightly into the Kendall County side, a little bit, west of Fair Oaks, a little west of the Canyon Lake Water Supply Company. And the purple line there is the Canyon Lake line that you get water from here, as well as we do until 2037. This is just a little bit closer up view to it. Again, the Canyon Lake pipeline. So we have our infrastructure is, I think it's a 24-inch, the red line that goes through there. The Canyon Lake goes into what we would call the Wynwood tank off of I-10. We have the Canyon Lake water, but again, I talk about redundancy. We always have a second or a third, water source, water pipelines coming in. So we have the Canyon Lake line, but assuming the Canyon Lake line goes away, either tomorrow morning because there's a line break, or 2037 when it goes away from a contractual standpoint. We have Edwards there to back it up. So all of those squiggly lines in there, which are basically the neighborhoods and the roads, we have the ability to serve them Canyon Lake, but the backup is Edwards. And as demand gets higher down in the Bexar County area, it pushes the Canyon Lake water actually further north. So when we talk about that's just a demand issue. But once you get into late 2030s, that demand is pushing further and further up north, and so there's a potential of Edwards water leaking sort of northward and getting ultimately onto the Kendall County side. And so that's where we have the issue of our CCN going into the Kendall County side. And then obviously if we're doing in a wholesale perspective, it's a long-term concern that we have that we're not able to provide Edwards water into those areas. And so what our board just did was approved a transfer. So this light blue area there in Kendall County that's part of our CCN, our board agreed to transfer that to Canyon Lake Water Supply at our last board meeting. We'll go through that process, and so the PCUC there on the CCN side, assuming that goes through the appropriate channels and the PUC agrees on it, that will ultimately become Canyon Lake Water Supply. And they will be supplying it through Canyon Lake Supplies and whatever other supplies that they bring online. For us, again, that takes care of the issue of serving Edwards water outside of the boundaries of the Bexar County, essentially, which is the Edwards boundary. Again, the plan is not to serve Edwards there anyway, but it's about that redundancy and those backup supplies. So again, our issue, after we've solved that issue of the Edwards going into that CCN area, you look at the WCID. This is the area that I mentioned. We have a wholesale agreement with them. Again, they are using purely Canyon Lake water. They have to build to our actually directly to the Canyon Lake water line, to Canyon Lake pipeline water line, if they can't get some relief in state law. And so they and others have looked to change some state law to make sure that we can serve that redundant backup supply. Assuming that never happens, they will have to take it directly from the Canyon Lake pipeline coming in. And so that'll be how we'll serve them. And then that supply agreement, that wholesale supply agreement, actually goes away in 2037, which is when we no longer have Canyon Lake supply at that time. So they'll have to deal with that. But it's a similar story to how we would deal with a City of Boerne wholesale supply. Again, does our board even want to go into that? That's one of the issues. But if we do, we have to deal with what would happen in the case of Edwards Supply getting up to the City of Boerne. So that would probably look towards a legislative fix if they would have to do that. I think our board would have some issues if not. Again, this is just all I've just said. If the possible sources at this point are Western Canyon, Canyon Lake Pipeline, and then Edwards, which would require legislation. At some point, we may build, Vista Ridge over to here. We can't get actually Vista Ridge over into this area at this point in large quantities, and so we would have to build some additional infrastructure. So that's the basics of our wholesale supply. I'll answer any questions, and we can go into some discussion.
On the brackish desal, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to state this. On the brackish desal, can you share anything about the cost on that and the scalability of that?
Yes.
Obviously, it's got to be one of your more expensive, if not the most expensive, water source. So.
Yeah, I think, it's our most expensive is Medina Lake, which is somewhere close to infinity because it's not there in drought record. I should have mentioned that. So I'll start with that. Vista Ridge comes in at a second at about 2,100, actually 22,068 or something to that effect. per acre foot. Brackish, I think last time I checked, I should have checked on it before, but it was about 1,600
Okay.
an acre foot. So it is expensive. It's not the brackish. The issue there is just the power. Again, it's going through these membranes, and you got to push it through, and so it's a whole lot of power cost. That's one we're learning because nobody had pumped out of the Wilcox Aquifer in that particular area. It's way down, and so we're learning that as you put more wells in, we're going to have to expand, like I said, probably far into Wilson County, maybe a little bit into Atascosa County, but that has some other issues.
Thank you.
But it's working well. We're obviously learning from the project. Ultimately, we hope to get about 30,000 acre foot out of that project. Right now, we're online. We're getting about 10 MGD, 11,000 acre feet out of it.
Right. Okay. And it's very scalable?
Yes, very
As long
scalable. In fact,
as long as you can get the raw water to it.
Yes. In fact, we actually built the plant so that we've already plumbed it for phases 2 and 3. So we already have all the piping in place, all the plumbing in place. All we have to do is plug and play some more membrane trains there, and then obviously drill some more wells. That's the big piece of it. But yes, already there, and obviously the infrastructure into town is already there, and we've got that project. The H2 Oaks is, again, we have 3 projects on one site. We've got the ASR plant, we've got the native local chorizo, and the brackish all on that one site. And we're running a test. Actually, right now we're running it at about 55 MGD. As we speak today, I think it gets back on at 55. We're going to next year try it at about 85 MGD. So we're going to run it, test it, make sure it's all running right.
Yeah, we were talking about direct potable reuse, things like we're seeing, and I was pondering. I was like, well, surely you guys have looked at it on one hand. On the other hand, I was thinking maybe your ASR operations solve for that, right? So you're still processing the water, you're introducing it to a natural stream, and then recapturing it. Is that fair to guess?
Or the reuse.
Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, there's purple pipe reuse, but then you also discharge to the stream, don't you?
Right.
And then
Yeah.
you
So
can recapture that.
we have about 125 MGD coming off of all of our wastewater plants. About 25 of that is dedicated to consumptive use for the purple pipe system. All the rest of it goes into the rivers, the river systems there, goes downstream, and about 50,000 of that goes into the Bronig and Calaveras Lake for CPS Energy for their use. So that is an indirect recycle system as part of that. And then the rest of it goes downstream. We're dealing with that for some other issues. We've got a permit process and working on that. But yeah, so about 50,000 of that goes downstream. And then as we increase, I got some other slides, I don't have it here, but in fact, when you go back to the 80s or 90s, our plans were, and our thoughts were that our effluent was going to increase substantially. And so there would be a lot more water in the river, a lot more water from purple pipe. Due to conservation, what we've seen is that it's totally flatlined over the last couple of decades. So it's an interesting, question in terms of water reuse and how that meshes with conservation. If you're going to go big on conservation, expect your water effluent coming out of your plants to be kind of flatlined if you do a good job.
Well, so SAWS is a really, I mean, you guys are doing awesome stuff. You really are. And I know that you all, I think, received some federal recognition for being very proactive in both conservation as well as water supply augmentation. And but one of the things that's come up that I'm just curious about is that, you started as like your city utility, but now it seems like there's a shift toward regional water supply. And I just wonder, I'm just curious, I guess, why that shift? Why? Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say there's been a shift towards regional water supply. That is not our goal or our part of our plan is to be a regional water supplier. I think what we look at, and I think I mentioned last time, we plan make sure our customers and we assume our growth. But along the way, if there are opportunities to partner with our regional neighbors, if that makes sense to us and to them and to the community, then that's an option.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say it seems like you really want to do that. Like, in other words, it's a goal, and that gets back to legislative change. I'm not knocking you. I'm just trying to understand it. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to say it's a goal. It's not a goal to wholesale water to other entities. Again, what our goal is to make sure that our customers and our community is taken care of. And if those opportunities present themselves, then that's something we'll consider. And I think it can make sense for a lot of the smaller communities and for growing communities to partner as opposed to going far away. That, those sorts of collaborative partnerships make some sense.
Donovan, on your ASR, you mentioned discharging to surface waters. Are you doing any reinjection?
So our ASR, we don't discharge to streams. That's put right back into the system. The reuse is what we do, discharge into the system. So yeah, the ASR water is literally Edwards aquifer water that we pump and pull out, and then we put it into the ground into the Carrizo.
Okay.
And then it kind of becomes kind of a new source, almost a new tank.
Donna, before, a couple of meetings before, Mark talked a little bit about EAA and its plans and some of the legislative issues that it's dealt with in the past. There's been some, I guess, interpretation issues with their statutory framework. And I understood from Mark that they may be approaching the legislature for some clarification on that. Have you guys looked into that? Have you participated in any of the drafting or communications related to that language?
We've definitely talked to the EAA about that issue in the past because, again, as we look at this issue that we've got in Kendall County before over the past, this has been an issue. We went to the legislature a few years ago, so we've been talking to a whole lot of people about a lot of different things. In terms of what I heard from Mark, we did talk to them, and I guess what they're talking about is approaching it from a CCN approach. So if you have a CCN that crosses over into the outside of the boundaries, that you're able to use that Edwards water in that area. So we haven't laid it out to our board yet to see if they want to support it, if it's something that they would support as a legislative initiative. Again, I think a lot of that would be taken care of, not taken care of, I shouldn't say it taken care of, but from our perspective, if this area in Kendall County is transferred to Canyon Lake, we wouldn't have that big issue in terms of serving our own CCN in Kendall County. Then the issue just becomes from a wholesale perspective, and then it becomes a little bit more of even a WCID and a Bernie if they want to go that direction. That's where it becomes. So that's where I don't know this time where our board will come down and if their board will want to wade into it. Obviously, we waded into it again the past couple of sessions, and it was very controversial and got a whole lot of people up in arms. And so sometimes it's who says something as opposed to what's said.
Right. And so just what I'm taking from what you've said is your board hasn't looked at the issue yet, hasn't been asked to look at it formally, and so it's unclear how they're going to come down.
This session, yes.
Okay.
Yes. That'll happen later on in this year. We'll go to them with our legislative agenda and just other ideas and where they would come down on that.
Okay.
When y'all were looking at ASR, did y'all evaluate other areas around San Antonio for locations that were suitable for ASR, or did y'all just focus in that one location?
I wasn't around then, so I don't know where all they looked. I think that one was they just found a sweet spot, and I say a sweet spot. It's harder to do it in the Edwards aquifer because it's flashy, or not flashy, but it leaks at the springs. It comes out at the springs, and so there's more questions in terms of that. Trinity is a similar model, and so the Carrizo is kind of that next spot. So I don't know where all they looked at that time, but that was it was kind of an obvious choice at that time.
So I'm just kind of curious, and of course, it's a mathematical question that doesn't have to be answered right now, but I was thinking about, Mr. Nichols, you gave a good presentation about projects that you all are working on. And part of me starts to go into a little bit of comparative analysis from a cost standpoint, because a big pipeline versus water that's right there already, on the border, which I'm sure has cost. But I know maybe Mr. Cahoon, maybe we're not supposed to be looking at those factors, but it's something that comes to my mind.
Well, I'm not telling you to put on blinders. All I'm saying is we don't make the decisions. I think we
Understood.
have to be informed. I don't want to say put your hand
Okay,
in the sand. I don't think
just want to make
that's
sure.
ridiculous. But
Fair enough. Just want to make sure it's in the purview.
no, I think it's these are always valid concerns. But I don't think we can make the decision to look at something or not to look at something based on a policy consideration. That's somebody else's decision.
Right. So it'd be the cost of water plus also the cost of infrastructure would be the considerations and things like that.
Among other things, yeah.
Among other things. Fair enough.
Yeah, and I'd say just in terms of that, the cost of infrastructure is an important thing. It's not just the pipelines to get it to your customers. Sometimes there's treatment associated with it. And, you go back to all those supplies, the diverse supplies. Pipes know the difference between one supply and the other, so we have to treat them to make sure that the pipes, we try to deceive the pipes and make sure that all water looks exactly the same in that pipe. That's very difficult, but so I'm sure obviously Bernie's got different sources as well, and so if they whatever supply they bring in, they're going to have to probably treat it to make sure that it matches all the rest of the supplies and is done in that right way. So there's a lot integration infrastructure is a lot to it.
Hey, Nick, there's also something in the chat, but we can't load up. Can you take a look at that, see what it is?
Michael, please.
Thanks. In terms of the drought of record, do you guys have rules of thumb that you've applied in terms of reduction on your various sources? Are there rules of thumb that you guys are able to use and share?
Every supply is entirely different. So, for example, we've got, I mentioned Medina Lake goes to 0. It's nowhere in there in terms of a supply. Trinity, again, is reduced. Every supply you have to look at independently. The Edwards is the one we can understand, I guess, the most. You do have to project what you think the Edwards aquifer level is going to be 60 years from now. You just don't know. Climate change, what does it look like in a particular year? Again, you have to plan for those. And so we have, that's a statutory cutback in the Edwards, whereas the other ones are just based on past experience and how they're pumping.
So have you guys done that for Canyon Lake before? I assume you do. So.
Yeah, Canyon Lake, we've got that plugged in, but Canyon Lake is a little bit different for us in the sense that it goes away in 2037, and so Canyon Lake again.
Very long-term planning. So.
Yeah, for our long term, but certainly for the near term. In fact, what we've got for Canyon Lake is we have about 4,000 acre feet, and then we take all the rest of it that's not being used by the other entities. So we've averaged about, I think, 8,000 or 9,000 acre feet over the past several years. Obviously, in any given year, that's going to go down. I think this year it's gone down substantially. And so it just depends on that year. But that's another piece to our planning is we have to plan for these supplies rolling off based off of contracts. Our Trinity supplies, we have that from 3 different sources, one of which goes away in 2027. So that comes right off the table in 2027. We have to plan for that. But in terms of cutback, the Canyon Lake is actually a very firm lake and a well-run project and is working well.
Well, we may have talked about this before, but the Vista Ridge water supply, it sounds like there's sort of this assumption that those are firm and that water supply is firm ad infinitum, or are there going to be issues long term with that water supply?
Yeah, I think that is one thing that we're going through as we look at this water management plan. What are we going to plan for Vista Ridge? Right now, we've got it planned for 50,000 acre feet, and we think it is a firm supply in terms of a water, as terms of a water source. The question is the groundwater district going to make curtailments? Are they going to cut back that water supply? What other water supplies are happening? They got new permits for the chip makers up in that area, Samsung and that sort of thing. And so are those going to put pressures on them? So those are the types of things we have to go through in the water supply, in the water management planning process. So this year, that'll be a discussion we haven't had yet. But in our water management plan, we'll decide whether we're going to plan for a 50,000 acre foot off into the project, or should we plan for some cutbacks during those worst droughts of the drought of record. That particular supply, again, it's two different aquifers. It's Simsboro and Carrizo. Very firm supplies, and they are very much always there. From a water supply perspective, it's a very firm supply.
It's a matter of the contractual capacity to access
Yeah,
it.
we have to sort of project of whether we think there will be cutbacks sometime in the future.
And are you all presuming just essentially just continual growth of your water supply system? And I mean, are you thinking out toward, essentially endless supply, desalination from the seawater? I mean, how, in other words, when does that sort of mindset shift, or does it?
We plan for 50 years out.
Uh-huh.
50, sometimes 55. We try to get to an even number, but roughly a 50-year planning horizon. And so part of that is population, part of it is growth from a land-based area and what we think that population. So we have to coordinate with the city. Although we're a separate entity, we have to coordinate with the city and make sure that our projections are the same. Some entities, we're essentially what we ultimately did was plan for, what we're looking at doing is plan for full migration through 2040, and then beyond 2040, do we plan for a half migration after that? I don't know if it will grow the same as it has been growing from here to eternity, back to 2070. Will there at some point be some drop-offs? Will people start moving to Kansas? I don't know. It's a question mark, and you have to make some assumptions, and that's why you relook at it every 5 years or more. But our plan right now is to look at a population growth at roughly full migration through 2040 and then half migration through 2070.
I know you guys are talking about letting the approximately 4,000 acre feet of GBRA water go back in the not too distant future, but there have been some discussions that Daryl brought up about other water being brought up from the south and southeast. Have you guys thought about or considered participating in putting in infrastructure to have access to those resources?
Depending on which project, you said the south and southeast. I know they're working on a mid-basin and a lower basin.
Either or. So it's a
Lower
question.
basin, we've looked at it a long time before, and I doubt we'll go down that road from a San Antonio basis. But I think part of it is, I talked about our long-term supplies, the expansion of the local Carrizo and expansion of the brackish. We have a whole lot of brackish supplies there as well. And so I think those are what are going to get us through the 2070 timeframe. Now, depending on, if our board or others want to make decisions to where we plan for a higher population growth, if we want to take deeper approaches to climate change, what will that do to our demand and our supplies? And there's a possibility that we could need additional supplies in the future. And so that's what we'll have to look at through this water management plan. But we think right now, and particularly with the 2017 plan, we think we've got enough water supplies to take us out through 2070.
So there's no plan at this point in time to push GBRA
No,
or run to the lower basin?
Donovan, are you guys working on a 2022 plan as well?
Yes.
What's the timeline to release that?
That'll be this year. It'll be before the end of the year. We're going through a process now where it's sort of all hands, a lot of the staff people from the different departments, different areas working on that together, arguing with each other about population growth, arguing with each other about, conservation goals, and should we do this watering restriction or that watering restriction, and lots of discussions back and forth on that. Those will all kind of culminate to a plan that we'll put out in the fall. And then, we're taking public comment as well right now, and hopefully get to our board and the city council before the end of the year.
Anybody else have questions about it?
And I would, point to that water management planning, I talked about regional partnerships. One of the discussions will be wholesale water. And so I think this discussion that we're having, particularly in Kendall County and Bernie, is what does our board want to do from a policy standpoint in terms of wholesale? And I think that's where you get into some of those policy questions, and that's where you get into, do we want to pursue legislation and all those sorts of things that,
Right.
that our board will have to make from a policy standpoint.
Makes sense. Okay. All right. If there are no other questions, thank you, Donovan. Appreciate the presentation and the information. We had previously talked a little bit about water reclamation, and Jeff, I think you were going to dig a little deeper and see if we could get someone to speak to that issue in terms of a broader sense, or, I mean, Mike and his team are already well on top of that from one standpoint, but what we didn't have more information on is there something there that we ought to be talking about? Is there more that can be done with reclamation that could make financial sense? And so,
Well, I have not received anything new. I don't know if Mr. Mann has anything. I know at one time we were having discussions with HDR about that, but I think that was pretty high level. So I defer to Mike if there's anything else that's been going on.
What specifically about reclamation?
generally, Mike, we were talking about, and I can't remember if you were here you were here for the last one. So the gist of it was we're already doing water reclamation and we're using it for irrigation and that sort of thing. And the thought was brought up, well, should we be asking whether we can use either increase that scale, or should we put it into a situation where at some point in time we're talking about making that potable water?
So it gets to be a supply versus demand issue,
It's
like anything else. And at
ultimately, God
present,
makes it back into potable water. One way or
at
another.
present, we're using most of it for irrigation in areas that are not irrigating with potable water, especially in a drought. So as plant improvements come online, as more people start discharging to the plant, to the newer plant, and I think that quantity will increase from a production standpoint to a point where we probably will have an excess over what we would plan to put on yards. And again, what's going on yards is offsetting the potable that would normally go on yards.
Sure.
So when will we have enough to start talking about direct or indirect reuse? Not in the very near future, being not in the next 5 years.
Right. But my question is, who do we talk to ask the questions so that we can get some sense of, okay, here are the hurdles, right? The financial, the timeline, the infrastructure, whatever hurdles are out there, so that when we go back to council, we can say, this is the box that we checked. We looked at it, and here are the basic hurdles. Here's kind of a cost structure. Here's where it's being done effectively. Let us know if you want us to dig deeper in that. Right.
Ben, did you want to speak to that?
Well, so I just talked to Mike before this meeting because I was thinking about this opportunity to at least find out more information about how San Diego and Oceanside and places like that are addressing essentially direct potable reuse. Now, it's not really direct potable reuse. It's still a classic thing where they run it through a buffer. In this case, they pump it down to the groundwater supply and then bring it back out. And I think it's a psychological thing. I mean, hell, North Texas lakes, they're doing that all the time. They're putting effluent in and pumping water out and treating it. So that's indirect reuse, and it's happening a lot across the state. But because we don't have sort of a confined aquifer, we do have the city lake that could be a buffer. But the point being that if we want to look at that, I was thinking it might make sense for me to see if I can get somebody to present to us would be great, but also to have a conversation with Mike as part of it with those folks, if I can get a subject matter expert on, since he knows his stuff through and through as far as our existing capacities and has a sense of the numerical situation for Bernie.
Yeah, and the big issue with indirect reuse is that once you pump it in somewhere, it's not your water anymore. The Texas, I'm not even going to get into groundwater stuff, but surface water is property of the state of Texas. So if we put it into the lake, it's not ours. We would have to work with the state to get a permit to pump additional water back out over what we're permitted for already. So presumably all those things can happen, but none of it is a no-brainer.
But no, and I'm not suggesting it for a moment. What I'm saying is that it's something that's out there, and so we ought to raise some questions and say, here are the hurdles for something like this. If you want us to learn more, then I just think it's incumbent upon us to ask all the questions we can.
Well, I can tell you from a high level, the first hurdle is political. People don't want to think about drinking water that came out of a sewer plant.
I get that, but how do I get all the questions answered? Are you the subject matter expert, or do we get somebody else? Because what I want to do is, one of the line items we ought to talk about is supply from this place, supply from that place, and reclamation. I mean, I think it's part of our homework to go in and say, okay, well, here are the hurdles. Versus political. There's a financial element. There's a timeline. There's infrastructure. There's all these things. I don't know what those things are. Who
Yeah,
can
I
answer that
don't
question?
know of anybody that's doing it locally. I think if we're going to get somebody to come in and talk to us from a subject matter standpoint, it's probably going to be a consultant that'll want to charge us. So if you want to do that, I will start looking for proposals from somebody and find out what that costs.
Well, what about San Diego or some of these people that are doing it? Wouldn't they share
I think
that
Wichita
information?
Falls is doing direct.
They're doing indirect. They were doing indirect. I think at one point they looked at doing direct. So right now, Bernie would be probably be the first in the U.S. that would do direct potable. It's being done internationally, in other countries, but in the United States, Brownwood looked at doing it about 10 years ago. They were going to be the first in the U.S. to do direct potable. It had less to do with water supply and more to do with control than anything else. Wichita Falls was looking at it potentially going a flange to flange, so it didn't get discharged. And I think they had it set up, and I think they got rain right before it happened. So I don't think it actually did direct potable use. They may have used the word direct a couple times, but I still think they were discharging it into either a lake or some type of pond that's mixed with raw water coming in.
I think the biggest hurdles, honestly, would be regulatory. We don't know what we can control, and we're very far into the reclaimed water game without regulatory control, at least in the state of Texas.
Right.
So we're doing something that is similar to what Florida does, and we're operating our system at a much higher level of a standard of care than the state's minimum requires.
Right.
Because we want it to be successful.
Sure.
If you're going to try to go flange to flange or even indirect reuse, what do we control? And the answer is probably very little.
Indirect reuse would be very challenging if you don't have an aquifer to put it in. I think your subject matter expert at this level is probably TCQ, because they went through that process with the city of Brownwood, and there is still at least one person there that was directly involved in that. But EPA has been putting out some information too on that. But TCQ would have information on what it would take to physically do that, and what type of treatment and what type of technology would have to be required. On the other side of that is the public acceptance of it.
Sure.
That's a separate thing that will have to be tackled, but we could probably get TCQ staff in here to talk about what they have set up for the type of requirements and the redundancy that they want to see for that to be an acceptable.
Right, and this goes back to the issue on policy. Obviously, we have to say there are lots of issues, and one of the policy considerations is people have a mental image where they don't want to be astronauts, right? They don't want that circular flow. That's fine, but that's a question for city council. I think it's incumbent upon us to ask these questions and say, okay, this may be a long shot, but let's ask the question. And let's get some people that are subject matter experts that can say, here's what you got to do. And there's some gray area in there. And then if the city council wants us to dig deeper, then they'll pull out their wallet and hire an expert that can tell us. But I'd like to do it on the cheap first off. But I want to know what the parameters are.
So is there anybody on the committee that would like to make contact with TCEQ, or would you like for us to do it?
I can. I'll arrange the contact with TCQ and loop you into it.
Okay, sounds good.
And I believe TCQ already has rules on direct potable. I think they went through a process a few years ago, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. I think we even participated in that. It's escaped me for now, but I think they have some rules on that. But again, it's not being utilized, and so
Right.
I'm sure they even learned. But the other thing I would say is, it's. I talk about our GPCD. You have to figure out what you're going to need water for, and is it for potable purposes or is it for irrigation? And just because I need 2,000 acre feet doesn't mean I need 2,000 acre feet of potable water.
Right, and it's when you need it
If
too.
that's coming from irrigation, then I think there's some discussion there to increase the recycle system without having to worry necessarily about whether it's potable or not. And so,
Which is essentially what we're already doing.
right, and that's what you're doing. And
We're just doing
Right.
it in a separate system.
I did have one question for you, Donovan. On your daily consumption numbers, was that a gross number across all customers, or was that residential customers? How was that derived?
The GPCD number? That's all customers, so that.
So it's a gross number.
Yeah, and in fact, I think our residential GPCD, our plans are to get down into the 50s, 50-something GPCD. Again, our plan for overall GPCD is about 88. Last year we used 111. I think this year, obviously, with the everybody's pumping more water, and so it's probably going to be a little higher this year. But,
Sure.
But yes, that's everything included.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Mann. All right. So that answers my water reclamation question. Thank you for bearing with me on that. And hopefully we can talk about that next time. All right. Supply side issues. We talked about the basin information that Mr. Nichols brought to our attention last time. We've talked now about SAWS. We've talked about the EAA issue. What other supply side issues have we not talked about that we ought to be talking about? What are opportunities that have not been addressed or identified?
We hadn't talked about drilling deeper, and whether or not that's even a viable option to drill down into the Ellenberger, if it's present. So
That's an interesting one.
Do we even have aquifer storage in Kendall County that anybody knows of?
there was in the water plan the city last did. ASR was one of the options that was added in there. So.
But I think they also pointed out that we don't really know much about the Trinity.
Mm-hmm.
That was one part of the consideration. It's just ports. We don't have anything specifically
Needed the hydrologic
identified.
data to really make that call.
I mean, conceptual is one thing, but do we have an actual, somebody's
Exactly.
identified, here's an old, somewhere, a well that's been tapped.
My understanding is the conventional assumption is it's not viable, at least with the Trinity, but am I wrong? I'm open to being wrong.
Well, I mean, Kerrville's doing it, so
Into the Trinity or into the Ellenberger?
in the Trinity.
Oh.
Yeah. We had early on to actually sit down and go up there and visit with them and tour their facility and look at what they're doing. I think we put that on hold because of COVID, and I think it's really prudent that we, resurrect that.
That'd be
And I can reach back out and make that contact.
Would you mind?
That would be
Yeah.
interesting.
We'll plan a field trip.
How do we, does anybody know how we find out whether or not we've got a potential location, a well that could be used? Anybody have a sense of that?
Not an existing well, not if we're going to Ellenberger, but if we're talking about putting water back in.
Yeah, let me look back at what the city did on the last go-round. I don't remember the details of it.
There's no specifics in that. It was just kind of a high-level view of what the possibility.
Yeah,
A what if?
yeah.
Does anybody know how we would find out if there is? Are there geologicals out there that would?
We'd have to engage
Have to hire somebody to look at
Yeah.
it. So the best thing to do is break up another hypothetical and say, here's what it would cost to maybe find it if it's out there. But having the Kerrville information is probably helpful to say, here's how it's working for somebody that's a little smaller scale like us.
Well, probably, Milan, you might remember when we were talking about, or we could check with Micah, when we were talking about mags for the district, a long time ago, we looked at Ellenberger and Marble Falls, and we looked at there's some oil well data along the Kendall-Kerr County line that went down and drilled well into that. Do you remember any of that detail about? Is any of that ringing a bell, or is that way back?
Hey, if you don't mind, come on up so we can hear you.
And I apologize for not speaking into the microphone. So.
To your question, does it ring a bell? Yeah, a very big one, because of the plethora of data from the oil and gas industry. Problem is trying to get to it in manageable form.
Right.
For what it's worth, I've been working with, gosh darn it, former chair of GBRA, Pam Hodges.
Right.
She and I have been talking about this and working with Dr. Mace, Texas Water Development Board, to try to recover some of that data and put it into a manageable form. So we from the Conservation District and then from outside sources, yes, have been looking at that. The feasibility, if I'm not mistaken, comes from studies that are based at the Water Development Board. You know, again, Dr. Macy spent a lot of time in this to look at areas of structure. I'm not saying there's a specific study available for Kendall County, but I know other areas that have thought about New Braunfels, for example, utilities, has proven feasibility for ASR. I think the situation up in Kerrville, that's a Lower Trinity project, and we don't have a lot of Lower Trinity production here, unless you know otherwise. I mean, we do have some, but it's not much.
It's not very prolific.
Thank you. That's good. Yeah, prolific. That's right. I think the other issues, the hickory, for example, isn't there an issue with naturally occurring radionuclides?
Right.
That becomes problematic because you have to treat it. You can do that, but there's treatment required. Comfort's a good example of that. WCAD number 1 has a very extensive network of treatment for radionuclides that, again, are naturally occurring. Ellenberger, I'm not really familiar with that. I know we have walked down that road with our consultant that did our last groundwater study, James Beach, looking at the potential to learn more about that particular aquifer. It's not one we deal with because, as you just said, it's not very prolific. So I guess the long answer is yes, it rings a big bell. A lot of opportunities to explore. Feasibility can be verified through consultants, but I think it really starts with the Water Development Board, to be honest with you.
Would James be a resource to speak to that?
I'm not
the committee.
I don't know, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Let me circle the.
Or maybe even Micah. I mean, I think it might be good to have him here as well. So.
No, I agree totally. I'll bring that up to him. The other thing I wanted to bring up, that not a comment or observation that we don't know much about the Trinity. To be honest with you, we know a lot more than we knew when you founded the district. To be honest with you, and that's no reflection of what you did. But we've had to do that by spending a lot of money, a lot of studies. And I would tell you that the beach study we just completed and posted to our website fills in a lot of those blanks. Good. Yeah, it's I just not correcting you, but just to throw out to the public, that report is on our website, and it explains a lot of things. Ms. Rudd brought up, one monitor well will produce over here, and the other one not very well. Well, there's actually one perfect example of that over there on Alvan Road, where 2 monitor wells are very close proximity to each other, but then the transmissivity is significantly different. One produces a lot, and one's virtually nothing. And that's why it goes to fill in those blanks. Yes, you're exactly right. As a whole, because of the multi-structure, there's a lot to be learned about the Trinity, absolutely. But then on the other side of the coin, I would tell you that our monitor well network and the studies, we've learned an awful lot, to be honest with you. So
the interesting thing about that is there may be some compartmentalization which would be helpful from an ASR standpoint.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No argument at all. Worth exploring. Thank you for letting me wander for a little bit.
Well, and then, of course, the question becomes what water source is going in? Are we storing it? So, yeah, I don't know.
Well, I mean, we were on the topic of indirect reuse. So,
yeah. Oh, fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good point.
Okay, so on the ASR issue, you're going to connect with Kerrville and reach out to Micah and Milan. Will you try to help coordinate some of that, maybe for next meeting? That'd be super. Thank you.
So Patrick, didn't early on we have Water Development Board talk to us about ASR and some of the studies that they were doing to identify locations?
I remember it covered at a high level and a fairly rapid pace, but yeah, I think it was covered in that gross overview of the stuff they were doing, yes.
It might be worth reaching out to them to see where they're at and what they either what they've done or what they have planned to do, and if they have anything, if they've even identified any locations here in the Hill Country to even investigate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good idea. I'm trying to remember the presenters. Do you remember names off the top of your head, Daryl? I can go look it up.
I cannot, but I mean, if you want, I can reach out to the Water Development Board.
If it's easy for you, great. If it's not, just let me know. I'll handle it. I just have to go back and figure out who was presenting and reach out to them.
Okay, I can get it.
Thank you.
Y'all know that Daryl used to darken the halls at the Water Development Board, so. Nah, he could have. GBRA was lucky to steal them away, so.
All right. Just by way of recap and really nothing else, join deeper reclamation, ASR, which has a connection, the GBRA, potential new opportunities, the former Saul's GBRA water that's coming back in 37, potential Saul's wholesale, and I know that not any one of this is necessarily viable. They're just, I'm getting ideas. This is a brainstorming session. What else needs to go on this list of potential sources? What are we missing?
I want to go to Ben's question. And Donovan, you had some of the exhibits, so we're going to ask you for some of those files, but we need some physical exhibits, some maps, to the question of what are we solving for? So the city limits, it's ETJ. There's already many of the properties that are currently under development agreements anyway. They would have to come to the city. What are the utilities, or CCNs and service areas? And we have pieces of all this, but we need to collate that into some exhibits and some maps. I think visuals are very helpful in answering that question. So it'll kind of help point to where there may be a potential increase in demand and that. And, there's some protected watersheds. There's some conservation easements in place. There's some things that where things cannot happen. And I think those are important to understand too. And, to some of the work that Ryan did, there's some critical parts of the watershed that probably above the lake that ought to be protected. And I think that ought to be one of the recommendations to the city as well, if we can quantify that or wrap something around that. So it'd be nice, and also to tie back to your maps and Darrell's, just what are the regional sources of water and where's that infrastructure currently lie? And you're thinking conservation, and the conservation stuff we're doing is important today, and every today. And we've done a good job of doing that so that we can utilize that this summer. Water planning is a multi-generational deal. You have to forward cast out there. And as Donovan said, sometimes it's going to be right, sometimes you're not going to be right. And that's okay, because the goal of leadership is to have a forward vision, to make sure the things we do today are done well and have forward vision to what might happen in the future. And that's our call. So we have to look at all these things. You have to know where there's potential for interconnection. We talked on probably the first or second meeting about being able in times of an emergency to have interconnections and be able to wheel water. And hopefully during this La Nina, we don't get to find out where we can and cannot do that.
Right.
But that's part of it too. That's a public safety issue.
So. And we've talked about this before. I've asked, and it's kind of gotten kicked around, where do we get the information of where's all the pipeline that's out there, so we can evaluate that and do overlays here and with our neighbors. And I think in some cases we've asked for it and not received it, and others we probably haven't asked the right person in the right way. But that seems to be something that would be nice to have. It'd be nice to know how we button up near SAWS, what the GBRA situation is, how we're doing with San Jose, and then we have wells and that connectivity. It would be really nice to have a sense of what's out there, so get a proximal understanding. And that will feed to the growth issue, right? And having some redundancy, planning for redundancy, so that you can do looping and that kind of thing, which will be an issue. So, who do we talk to? I'm sure. Mike, for the city's concerned, is going to have a lot of what we would want from the city, but expanding on top of that, I don't know. Who's going to have the information we want? And we need to identify it with some specificity, because if you just say, hey, give me maps, who knows what you're going to get?
Well, you had that infrastructure map in this presentation, right? That was actual served area, not CCNs.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to volunteer Kurt and I to help correlate this and identify where we have gaps and holes in it. So
Can we get the GIS file?
Yeah, I
for that
can,
map?
the GIS file. I don't know about the GIS file. I can certainly provide this map.
Well, we can recreate it from that, but it'd be easier if you had the GIS file.
Yeah.
I can get the GIS file for the Western Canyon line.
Okay.
Fair Oaks, you can get I mean, really, I think you're probably looking at really the main entities are going to be San Jose, which includes Kendall West. You have Bernie, you have Saws, you have Fair Oaks, and you have the Western Canyon line. I mean, I think if you're looking at who may be a partner in any kind of project or water sharing, you're really narrowing it down to those unless you want to go further up north. And so I think if you can work on trying to get, the contact for each one of those to see if they, can share any what kind of pipeline information they want to share.
Sound good?
Okay, yeah, if you wouldn't mind sending that to me, it'd be good. I'll collect it and start putting it together.
That's great. Thank you, guys. Appreciate that. So in addition to maps, what else in terms of visuals or data do we need to help cast this or put context to what we're hoping to provide to the city, right? Here's options A through Z, whatever those are. Here's some context, right? They'll have a lot of context directly for the city from Mike, but what about surrounding areas and that kind of thing? I guess GBRA is going to have a lot of data in terms of service areas.
Really, it's just CCN map from DUC if you're looking at service areas. I mean, we've got our regional pipeline. We show where the connection points are on that to deliver water to the various entities. But you're not going to see a whole lot.
But you can talk about supply side use.
We can talk about supply side, yes.
And so that would give us some sense of that, which I think needs to be factored in. I mean, we have an idea of what we're doing locally, but we don't have any idea of what other people have and what their potential supply side issues are.
In terms of providing information to council, it would be good to compare the Region L population projection numbers with the updated census values and the delta between those two.
Because it's dramatic.
Yeah.
Tommy had mentioned earlier the drought of record, and it brought to mind, does Cow Creek have a good sense of drought of record impact on local wells? Because that's a big unknown for us. I mean, when we talk about the city, we're talking about pipeline and connections, but the rest of the county is pretty much on local wells. Mm-hmm. And, we've said supplying the water to the rest of the county as our mission has expanded or grown on a broader view. And go back to your notion that this year might provide a unique educational opportunity if we are indeed on path for another 2011. Being able to anticipate what we may see across the county for the balance of this year might give us a real strong talking point going forward.
Milan or Kurt, you want to talk to that at all? It's partly a Micah question, but Milan, you want to try something? Because I could wing something, but
On the drought of record?
Yeah, and you might have something to throw in there.
Well, and keep in mind, not just the drought of record from a meteorological standpoint, but we have societal drought just because of the demand and stresses, population stresses. There's not 6,000 people here like there was in the county in the 50s. Mm-hmm. More significantly greater. So
that's a great observation. There's a societal drought, there's an agricultural drought, there's a meteorological drought. And then in that context, to give you a straight answer on the conservation district, and you two directors can certainly chime in at any time. Everything we do is relative toward an extended drought. Mm-hmm. Is there fidelity to the level that a SAWS would put together an analysis? Because our water sources are modeled, to be honest with you. And that modeling it can be very precise, but it's backed up by a monitor well network. So we can validate that. And that's also what went back to, I mentioned the James Beach study a little while ago. There is some exploration into an extended drought of record. It may not explicitly say, Texas drought of record, this is what we're exactly looking for, but we do have data that goes back to that time frame, whether it's stream flow or well conditions that are on record with the Water Development Board, where conclusions can be extracted. You know, I just don't want to say, you know, unequivocally, yes, we plan for a 5-year drought of record, but common sense-wise, we do all the time, absolutely. You guys have something to add to that?
I'll just say, I'm telling you your question, I mean, as far as the effect on any given well, it's really hard to tell because there is so much variability within the county. The James Beach report does actually help because we can start looking at areas of the county. And I think, you know, as we continue to bolster that and do more research and get more monitoring wells on our network, we'll be able to hone that in and give people a lot better input on, like, well, how's this going to affect me where I live? I'm sure a lot of people in this county know they're on a really bad well. It, you know, produces 2 gallons a minute or something, and they already know their effect is pretty great when we get a drought. But, you know, you start to see some of these other things. I was talking with Micah the other day about these reoccurring, you know, cycles, especially in the older wells that aren't cased. You know, you start to see the cycling of drying out and, you know, the water levels coming back up, and you start to see those wells start to collapse over time. And so you start to see those effects, which really it's really not a dry well. The well's still there. I mean, the well pump is now, you know, encased in mud because it was collapsed, but they can re-drill it and go back in there and but those are the type of effects you see people have during these times when you get these really low water levels, when it dries out that uncased portions of the well, and you start to see the collapses. But we're hoping, you know, in the future to try to get more and more data to help people understand their own individual impact in the county.
I do want to piggyback on something that the Water Development Board notes. I spent a lot of time studying the state water plan, and the 22 state water plan is very clear in a caution to not base everything on a 5-year drought of record, because there have been worse ones. Right. And not being lulled into a false sense of security, that is the benchmark. That's the only planning factor. It's a benchmark, and it's extremely credible because of the data that's available. But the water plan for 22 does note to be cautioned that there have been worse record droughts. Records of more extended, and then as Tommy pointed out, currently exacerbated by the increasing population every year. And that's also reflected at the legislature level with Senator Perry. He makes that observation a lot. Don't be lulled into a false sense of security. That is the only thing we have to put up with. We should be looking beyond a 5-year drought of record, recognizing it because of the data available. But again, to Tommy's point, what do we have as a backup to the backup to the backup when everything starts falling apart?
Right.
In my opinion, rainwater harvesting will fix that, but that's my personal thought.
So it kind of begs the question, going back to James Beach and the recent study, but is there a way that we could forecast a hypothetical scenario with where we have, you know, minimal recharge, and even if we were to say pumping was curtailed to some degree, you know, how many people at their current their pump levels go dry?
You're talking about predictive analysis.
That's right.
And then in reality, all predictions are in error. Some have value. That's how you want to take from that. You know, but yes, it's worth absolutely not dismissing what you're saying. Yeah. But I think you'd have to. I don't know how to model that. I'm not a modeler.
No, right.
I just look at the water that's in the well, and Kurt pointed out, you know, it changes based on conditions.
We're doing exactly that in our water management planning process. We've engaged a consultant to go through that, and we're focused on the Edwards at this point. But what does that look like? And you have to look at, you know, recharge into particular streams. You've got to know where it's going to fall, and you put it in the little cells. And we've run into some hiccups with it along the way. The modeling, you know, which model you use, you're going to have to probably create a new model for it. It's a very worthwhile exercise. It's going to be wrong, you know, that you have to look at that. But it's going to take some money and some time, and again, it'll be wrong. You'll have to just take it with a grain of salt and try to get what you can from it. You're just not going to get perfect data from that. But I'll echo, I forget who it was said, but if we talk about, particularly in the Trinity, it's very site specific. It's very well specific. Yep. I mean, this is really everywhere. It's not just the Trinity, but it's pronounced within the Trinity. Very highly pocketed, very highly dependent on your particular well. So I think you'll need some groundwater district data from it, but you're going to need, you know, very specific discussions with the operators, probably from Mike's side, and how each well is working and how, they got those transducers set, how deep are they and how far is that well being drawn down? So, and how much more can it produce over time? So you're going to get into some very, very specific things.
It's very complex. It's very hard to
Yeah.
do, which is why I was trying to see what these other guys had to offer first, because that's right.
The only other thing I'd offer, and it's totally out of the box here, and it gets into our earlier discussion of who are we and who are the policymakers, and are we trying to assume a certain amount of water need that they are going to need? Well, that means we have to assume that the city is going to grow to this particular area. We're making a lot of assumptions there that people might see as, is that a decision? Is that you're trying to set the policy? So there's back and forth there. When we got ultimately what led to the Vista Ridge project, the process that we went through, let me go all the way back to 2008 and even before. We had our new CEO at the time, Robert Puente, who's the current CEO still, but he came in, he was a former legislator, everybody knew him, so everybody with a water project came to him and said, hey, just buy my water project, just sign here. You remember when we talked in the legislature, and we had everybody coming to us with different water projects. Ultimately, he said, let's just do an RFI, let's do an RFI, which led to an RFP, ultimately to say, if you've got a water project, if you want to tow an iceberg from Alaska down here, just give me a proposal here. Tell me what projects are out there, and then I can analyze them, compare everybody on equal footing and see what we think is a reasonable project versus what is just kind of these speculative type projects. I don't know who's going to be willing to participate in something like that if the city council, I think the city council would have to make a decision, hey, we need 2,000 acre feet, 5,000 acre feet, whatever they want to throw out. And a possibility could do an RFI and say, whoever's out there, if you've got other ideas out there, we'd love to see them. What other proposals are out there that we could look at. So we have some ideas. Obviously, we've kind of narrowed down some of the ideas that make the most sense, but there may be somebody that wants to pull water from the Mississippi River and bring it over here, and maybe that makes sense. So that's just kind of an outside-the-box thinking that ultimately we did, and I think it was ultimately a good process. We went through this, and it was over a long period of time, and we got all of the specialists and operators involved in it, and it led to what we think was a good project. So rather than try to pre-assume what the projects will be, what the universe is, assume that universe, but also open it up to anybody else that might have an idea we're not looking at.
So a couple of things. First of all, Patrick, I apologize for interrupting you a couple of times earlier. That question well, I know you're an attorney, right? So, but that question about what are we solving for has been nagging me. It has really been nagging me for a lot of reasons. It's not just anti-growth, because I'm actually assuming that there are other water providers that will love to fill the vacuum and provide the water. And that water often comes with zero caveats in terms of development outcomes, quality of development outcomes. So I'm sensitive to what you said a long time ago, because I agree that, okay, this could be a hook that the city could use to influence development outcomes. But then, obviously it's hamstrung a little bit by, we're hamstrung by annexation, but then also how do you ensure that hook's used well? Because we have had different city leadership that, depending on whose opinion is in the room, is good and positive as far as quality development outcomes, or really negative and kind of wholesale. Here's whatever you guys want. And so that's the thing. And so part of me sitting there going, what are we solving for? Because are we really solving for water? Because I think that water will be provided by some entity.
But that, again, we're going to policy.
Well, I know,
because they have to weigh those things and say, well, gosh, if these are the items we have to choose from, if this is the buffet,
right?
And we want to achieve, and they have to decide what the goal is: more people, less people, a different kind of people,
right?
Taller, shorter, whatever. They have to make those decisions. Then they pull from the buffet. Well, let's try this, and let's try this, and let's try this other thing. And these things we think will, fill in those gaps and satisfy our formula. So I get and appreciate where you're coming from. It just, I don't have the information. I can tell you none of them sitting on city council have the information. They're going to need to work with the citizens and themselves to come up with results that will dictate where the next step of this goes. That's why this is literally just an exercise in absorbing information and providing that to city council in a way where they can say, yes, no, and tell me more about this.
Yeah, okay, so I do hear you on that. I nonetheless, still, for me, it's like a fundamental thing. What are we solving for? I ask it a lot of things I work on. I don't know why I work really hard and try to find out information if you're not trying to solve a problem. I mean,
right, there is a perceived problem, right?
There's a perceived problem,
and there are actual problems.
Well, sure.
And to your point, solving that problem is a policy problem, and I mean,
yeah,
it's just not going to be solved here. I can guarantee
Why
you
can't
that.
the problem just be the lack of information?
Could be
The lack of information for the people who need to make the policy.
Yeah,
And it'll dictate what the scope of results, possible results are.
Yeah.
If you want to have unlimited growth here, then you're looking at the maximum possible series of alternatives that we know of at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can say with some margin of error, here are the maximum number of acre feet you'll ever have here, right? Based on the information we have now for a forecastable period of time, right? So here's the maximum damage you can do. And then you factor into, okay, if we did these things and those things and we took about the cost factors and all these others, here's what we could afford, right? Those are all, it's just, I'm not saying that that's not a question to ask. I think it's the crucial question to ask. But you can't even begin to evaluate what the answers to the questions might be so you can make a decision amongst them until you get the information.
No, fair enough. And so, I'm just posing the question for the broad consideration of other folks. You brought up how it has a relevance to you. I mean, I think it's got some relevance as well.
It's relevant to all of us.
I mean,
It's just not our
and there
decision.
may be other angles on it. There may be revenue generating for the city angles. I mean, I don't know. So I'm really willing to look at what the opportunities are, what the issues are, what we're trying to solve for, but what the opportunities are. I am, but I can't help but think about that stuff as I drive down the road.
That's fine, and that will be part of the question is, what do you want us to solve for once we give you the information? Right? The conservation thing is a lot more encapsulated, right? Because there's a finite resource and we're doing the best we can to conserve it. This is a whole different deal.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is what it is. But there are components to it that go to collaboration with neighbors and emergencies and all kinds of other things that you really can't begin to answer those questions until you have some of the information, like the maps and what is our connectivity and what are the options in terms of,
Well, when you put information in front of decision makers, I mean, it's like being a consultant. Oftentimes, our job is to provide the client with the information with which they can make a business decision. In that case, it's a dispassionate presentation of the information. There's good options and poor options, and they pick the one they want to pick, and then they allocate the financial resources to do it. And I think a big part of our job, is to provide that well-vetted information to city council, to which then they can absorb and process, ask salient questions, task us with any other additional steps to take, and then they can begin a planning process, and they can add that to their budgeting process of what are those options they want to explore and they want to fund and they want to do that. And it'll be today's leadership that does that for the future generations, just like yesterday's leadership did that in building Bernie City Lake and moving away from the 2 water wells down there where the old fire station used to be and putting additional water wells in, additional storage, and we all benefit from that. So it's to give those leaders something they can use that's solid. And they have to decide on going forward. That doesn't mean we can't passionately argue one way or the other for the information, but I think we got to get it developed first and vetted and argued here. So
agreed. And Ben, to your point, I mean, part of the presentation, if we're just given the Google result, then we've not done our job. So it does come with, there needs to be analysis that goes with it, and the analysis needs to be couched in terms of, if your goal is X, then here's an expected result. Here is an unintended consequence if your goal is X. If your goal is Y, then kind of the same analysis. And I think that's the value add from having so many smart people with experience here that can bring that to the table. It's not just, hey, you can go down the street and run some pipeline. Well, let's talk about cost. Let's talk about time. Let's talk about what are your goals as a city. Do you want to limit growth? Do you want to have the ability to control neighboring areas? Do you want to be bigger? You want to be smaller? What other tools are in your tool belt? And I think those are important observations to make. We just don't have, we can't narrow the focus of
Yeah.
what for yet.
Well, no, fair enough, and I agree with you. Yep, I agree with you.
Okay. On the needs list, to make sure that we try to address what you brought up, Tommy, I have maps, stuff to do with watersheds, the census versus regional comparison. What other tools do we need in the tool belt now that Mike Mann's left and he probably has the answer? That will help us give context to
Yeah, I was
some of
thinking
these
about
items.
the population numbers. I need to visit with the school district and their demographer and get their demographer's data and information.
I mean, I think that's as helpful as anything, just because the census data is kind of this moment in time. The L data is inaccurate,
Right.
and the school district is the one that is really in it day in and day out. And they've got more of a regional approach anyway, which is, I think, beneficial for the way we're looking at things.
So I think that's, I've got the map
Question.
stuff listed here, and then I've got some other graphical information relative to population, and I have a school demographer on here. So I'll contact Dr. Price and initiate that contact to get that information for us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'll tell you, on population, it's a very, very, it's a difficult topic. A lot of people use the Texas State demographer, and, again, that goes through roughly the 2040, and they go beyond, but even they'll tell you, once you're going beyond the 2040 timeframe, 20 years out timeframe, you're really speculating.
idea.
And so some people will then take that detour and continue planning for the high growth. Some people will sort of moderate, and that will be a big decision, and obviously a huge impact on the water needs. And so,
And that's why this is such a problematic issue, because it takes 10 to 30 years to put the infrastructure and the relationships
Yeah.
and so forth in place to handle this, and you don't know what's going to be on the other end of that deal. So,
but I'll kind of wade into the back and forth in terms of what we're solving for and all that. But what we haven't really talked about is water quantity, and obviously that, if the city wants unlimited growth and wants to grow, become a huge regional area, and they're going to need 10,000 acre feet, that may be one project. 2,000 acre feet as kind of a backup, it may be an entirely different project, and it may be entirely different. So what might work out of a 24-inch pipeline a mile away may not at all work in a 10,000 acre feet. We want to grow like wildfire type of an area. So, those kinds of things I think will need to be in. If it's kind of here's some data to look at. If you're looking at a big growth opportunity, you're going to need to do your own big project. I think even, obviously I can't prejudge an ASR discussion. I personally don't think you're going to get a lot out of a Trinity Aquifer ASR here. Obviously it's something we can look at, but so I think quantity needs to be a piece of that as well, and that's where you get into what are you trying to solve for. I don't know.
yeah, and a lot of this, I think we're gonna hit some dry holes on a lot of this, but I don't want to fail to ask the question.
I agree.
And then we say at least, hey, we talked about that, we looked at that, and it wasn't viable, or at the time for whatever reason. But if we don't ask the question, then I don't think we've done the job.
Yep.
All right, I've held you guys over time. If there are any parting comments, otherwise I'll put this in the next agenda and lean on you guys to do what you said you were going to do. And
Yeah, what were the other reach outs? Because someone's going to get caught Kerrville.
Tommy's on
Right, I'm
Kerrville
gonna reach back out.
and Tommy Price.
Or we're going to reach out to Wichita Falls or something along those lines? Brownwood?
I was going to reach out
TCEQ is what I
to
understood Daryl's saying.
TCEQ and Water Development.
Yep.
They update every 2 years, but it's still a foggy crystal ball.
All right. Did I answer your question, Kurt?
Yep.
Okay. Anything else for the good of the order? All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're adjourned.
Good meeting.
Council.